Okay, welcome folks, and thank you for joining the QBCC Plumbing Compliance webinar. My name's Harm Takura and I will be your MC for today. I'm the Education and Events Coordinator for the QBCC Education and Engagement team. And just before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm speaking to you from and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which each of you are living and working, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Just quickly with housekeeping in terms of the survey. So at the end of the webinar, you'll get a survey asking for your feedback. It only takes a couple of minutes to fill out, and it really helps us plan for events that are relevant to you, which is important. In terms of audio settings, if you can't hear the sound, make sure you check your device settings. So for Android users particularly, use the volume buttons as normal, but this time adjust the media channel volume, and that should help. In regards to questions, please send through those questions through the chat box that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, and it's shown in the slide you can see on your screen there. And you can ask questions as soon as you think of them via the webinar chat box, and we'll see if we can get to them in the Q&A. And without any further delays, our presenters today, Grant Wilkinson, who is the Principal Investigator with the QBCC Plumbing Investigations team, and also with us today is Zane Russell, who is an auditor with the QBCC Non-Conforming Building Products team. Thanks, Grant, and thank you, Zane, for joining us today. And Grant, I'd just like to invite you to turn your camera on and your microphone, and then we can get started with the presentation.
Great, thanks, Harm, and good afternoon to everybody. As Harm mentioned, my name's Grant. I'm just going to go through this first part of the session, just talking about the sort of regulatory approach that QBCC has in relation to defective work. Considering the sort of the functions of the QBCC, and I'll just go through a bit of a case study just to sort of demonstrate again the approach that we take in terms of defective work carried out by licensees. So just in terms of the plumbing reforms, as you probably already know, the reforms back in 2018, it established a modernised sort of regulatory framework insofar as being more sort of streamlined and contemporary. And this is generally for the benefit of consumers and sort of more broadly for the plumbing and drainage industry. So these reforms provided for consistency, particularly in relation to sort of maximum penalties for offences under the Plumbing and Drainage Act. And this was sort of similar in terms of the offences that were found under the Queensland building laws. It introduced a sliding scale of penalties, particularly in relation to unlicensed plumbing and drainage work. So notably here, the highest penalty can also apply, and that's regardless, particularly when we're sort of talking about work that's found to be grossly defective. So what this does is it actually places a sort of a emphasis on a strong regulatory approach to ensure public health and that the environment is protected. Grossly defective work, as I mentioned before, is that which falls below the standard that is reasonably expected of a person that holds a license to do the same work. And also accompanying this is obviously there's a likely that the work will endanger a person's life or physical safety, or alternatively, or not alternatively, but in addition to, it may also pose a significant health risk to anybody. So the Act provides an example of what may constitute defective work. This includes a situation where a hot water heater is installed in a house without a temperature control device. This particular example is used to describe grossly defective work in the context of unlicensed work, but we find that this situation can also feature in the work that is actually carried out by licensed plumbers. So I will just go through and briefly mention the QBCC's function in relation to plumbing and drainage work and provide, like I said, provide an example of the regulatory approach in tackling non-compliance by licensees. And hopefully you'll see some of the benefits in having a interagency collaboration like I said, in particular with regards to reporting non-compliance. So in terms of the functions of the QBCC Commissioner, the Act establishes the function of the Commissioner, and this includes, but it's not just limited to, but there are a couple of examples up there on your screen, and one of those is receiving and investigating complaints about plumbing and drainage work, for which a licence is required, and also it's the part of the Commissioner's function is to promote acceptable standards of competence for the plumbing and drainage trade. Now, education is one of those tools that the QBCC uses in actually promoting acceptable standards of competence. The QBCC is actually currently working on educational videos, which will be available to the plumbing and drainage industry at large. There is a particular focus at the moment on the installation of hot water heaters, but we also do recognise that there are other issues of non-compliance that exist in the trade, and an example that sort of comes to mind is the installation of overflow relief gullies. So we do intend on publishing more videos, both in the short and also the longer term. Another tool at hand for the QBCC is obviously the exercise of enforcement powers, such as prosecution, issuing infringement notices, or taking disciplinary action. So with regards to handling infringement notices themselves are relatively quick and typically an efficient way of dealing with minor offences. Circumstances where disciplinary action would be more appropriate, it might include where we have repeat or deliberate offences or behaviour by licensees that has caused serious detriment to consumers. So one of the main purposes of the PD Act is to actually regulate the carrying out of plumbing drainage work in a way that reduces risk to public health and safety, and also the environment. So the Act gives the QBCC Commissioner discretion to exercise power and commence disciplinary proceedings against a licensee. As you can see on the screen there, we do have a set of or a list of grounds in which the Commissioner can take disciplinary action against a licensee. The QBCC will generally deal with complaints and investigate matters on their own individual merits. And this is having regard to the evidence in its totality. So disciplinary action should be directed primarily to the protection of the public rather than the punishment of errant licensees. So whilst the consequence of taking disciplinary action may operate as a form of punishment, the action is not punitive, but it's rather protective in nature. So therein lies a desirability of maintaining and enforcing standards of the plumbing and drainage trade, and it also promotes public confidence in the same. So the grounds that are listed in the Act include, as you can see on the screen there, where a licensee has not competently carried out or has been involved in the unsatisfactory carrying out of plumbing and drainage work that the actual licensee is authorised to carry out. Another ground there is where a licensee has directed a person to carry out permit work in a way that doesn't comply with the permit or any of the conditions that have been placed on that permit. There's also other grounds, including, for example, where licensee in carrying out the plumbing and drainage work, they've actually failed to have regard to a guideline that is relevant for that work. An example here might be where we have a guideline set by or published by the department for the installation of temperature control devices. There's another one there in terms of the licensee supervising or directly supervising plumbing and drainage work, and they failed to have regard to a guideline that is relevant to the supervision of that work. And two, the last two there, you can see where licensees contravene a provision of the Act, and I'll sort of talk about that a little bit more in a little bit, but you can also see that there are grounds there when a licensee has actually been convicted of an offence against the Act. And it says the repealed act, which means the 2002 version of the Plumbing and Drainage Act. And it also relates to offences in relation to the Queensland Building and Construction Commission Act also. So the regulatory approach that we have is based on incidences that happened in the past, and largely it relies on consumer complaints. This is not necessarily to say that the process is less effective than a proactive strategy of compliance, but the point I'm trying to make is that QBCC requires knowledge of these incidences in order to affect any change in the standards of work that is carried out by licensees. So I just wanted to go through a bit of a case study, and this is in relation to disciplinary action that the Commission took against a particular licensee. The decision itself was to issue conditions on a licensee's license. When I'll go through some of the sort of the history behind our investigation and sort of the reasons why we took disciplinary actions and why we took that particular disciplinary action in terms of issuing a condition on that person's license. So this particular case, the QBCC received multiple complaints from multiple sources about defective work by a particular plumber and drainer, and this involved 2 separate properties. Throughout that investigation, we did identify that there was an additional property, and that particular complaint or that property, it was alleged that there was further defective work. So in this particular case, or in these cases, we identified that the work itself was notifiable work, and then that person was either supervising the plumbing work or personally carrying out that work. Some of the issues that we found throughout the investigation related to hot water heater installations, but also involved renovation work as well. So I'll just list off a couple of things that we found during that investigation in particular, which was the safe tray for the hot water heater was holding water and not draining. We found that there was an isolation valve that wasn't accessible from the finished or from the floor or finished surface level. There was inadequate insulation on the external pipework for the hot water heater installation. In terms of the renovation, we found that the gully was installed under a concrete slab, and we also found that the vent that was installed off the gully riser. So as you can see there, there's a few issues in question there, and quite serious in nature. So also, in addition to the defective work, we found that the plumber and drainer had been identified as being previously issued with an infringement notice for alleged defective work. We found that person actually hadn't paid the fines. So in this case, monetary penalties were not really going to serve as an appropriate means of deterring any future offending. So, like I said before, the decision was to take disciplinary action and to issue conditions on their license. The condition was to either have the work inspected by local council through the permit process, or alternatively, the work had to be supervised by another licensee. So the requirement would be for that plumber who was issued disciplinary action to actually engage another licensee to supervise that work. So the reasons why the action was taken was to minimise any harm to the public, whilst it was also there to reduce any financial distress to the plumber and drainer as a result of employing another person to supervise the work that was being carried out, or any of the costs associated with the permit as well. In this particular case, there was nothing to suggest that the plumber and drainer was actually not confident to carry out minor work. And so the notifiable work, when it was if it was to be inspected by local government under a permit, this would ensure that the work is being overseen and that any of the non-compliant work would be remedied by way of an action notice. The second element or part of that was that where it was supervised by another licensee, this would actually ensure also that the work was being overseen, and that the supervising licensee would sort of bear some responsibility for that work being carried out. So having those two options conditioned upon that person's license, it gives that person the ability to decide which would be most suitable for their business. But it obviously ensures that the work is going to be overseen either by a local government or by our supervising licensee. So it maintains integrity, I guess, of the system or the work that's being carried out. So in terms of interagency referral, the QBCC appreciates the important role that local government plumbing inspectors have in monitoring and enforcing compliance with the Act. The assessment inspection of plumbing and drainage work obviously being a core function of that role. This makes you a pretty valuable partner in terms of regulating carrying out of plumbing and drainage work in Queensland. And local governments obviously have their own way in sort of dealing and managing non-compliant plumbing and drainage work. And generally speaking, they're confined to sort of just issuing notices for the work to be rectified. And this could be by way of an action notice or could be by way of an enforcement notice. So this may result in the work being rectified, but there is no additional consequence with this. So we know, however, that there are licensees out there who continually carry out work in a way that doesn't comply with the code. So in order to improve the standards of work performed by licensees, it's necessary for QBCC to investigate these occurrences, and if so relevant, take disciplinary action against them. This in turn is likely to support the local governments insofar as increasing the likelihood of any future work carried out by the licensee in terms of complying with the code requirements. So you can see having a sort of implementing some sort of interagency referral system would have great benefits, both to the local government in terms of making sure the standards of work are improved through action taken by the QBCC. But you can see there are benefits also to the plumbing and drainage trade by holding licensees accountable for their work. As I mentioned before, one of the grounds for disciplinary action includes contravening a provision of the Plumbing and Drainage Act. So the QBCC is invested in ensuring licensees are meeting their statutory obligations. And like I said, if they're not, they're held accountable. As you can see on the screen there, we've got a couple that are sort of relatively important in terms of contravening the Plumbing and Drainage Act relevant to taking disciplinary action. And these are just examples. There are obviously other offences out there that are also relevant, but these are pretty important and key to some of the work that we see come across our desk. So as you can see there, Section 64 relates to complying with code requirements, 65 installing things as part of plumbing and drainage work, and this sort of it has some connection to the non-conforming building product legislation, which Zane will talk about in a moment. And then we also have Section 66, which is permit work required for permit, and Section 83, which relates to notifiable work offences. So as you can see there, I've just explained some of the regulatory approach that we have and sort of talking about, working with local governments to sort of see and know about errant licensees that are out there. So we want to work with local governments to receive information from them about these errant licensees so we can sort of look at whether there are grounds for disciplinary action, and if so, look at taking the necessary enforcement action against them to prevent and improve the standards of work that are being carried out by our licensees. So if you have any complaints or any or have knowledge of people that you would want to refer for further investigation, please send that information to us through that complaints inbox. And if you've got any further detail or any further questions, our details are up there on the screen. And I'll leave it at that and pass you back to Harm. Thanks, Harm.
Thanks very much, Grant. There was loads of fantastic information in there. Thank you for that. And we'll move on to our next segment with the wonderful Zane Russell. Zane, if you're able to turn on your microphone and camera, and we'll get into it for you, and I'll just pop away. Thanks very much, Zane. Cheers.
Thanks, Harm. I've got a quick question for Grant. I've got a problem with my hot water system. It's not big enough for the kids. They keep coming home and using all the hot water. We need to come up with a device that will solve that for us. Well, welcome everyone. Today, I'll be talking about non-conforming building products for this part of the presentation. I'll be talking about what is a building product and what is a non-conforming building product. And I'll try and relate this to plumbing products and the Watermark certification so that it's relevant for you as plumbing inspectors. Whilst today is about plumbing and the non-conforming building product information is applicable to all building products, I'll briefly look at and explain some definitions and give you some examples to assist with the NCBP overview. I'll talk about duties relating to NCBP, and I'll give you some information on how you can provide details to us if you suspect that you've got an NCBP or you need to pass information on to plumbers that you talk about so they can give us information about something they've seen on site or on plans. So I'll move into the definitions. So our Act defines these for us, and the important one is on the top of the screen there, a building product, which is any material or other thing that is associated with or that could be associated with a building. Noting the underlined parts on the screen there, they are defined terms within our QBCC Act. So a building product is a non-conforming building product for an intended use if, when it's associated with a building, it is not safe, it does not comply with the relevant regulatory provisions, or the product does not perform or is not capable of performing to a standard which is represented by a person in the chain of responsibility. One of the important definitions for the building product that we keep referring to, and you'll hear throughout today, is intended use. That is the product's intended use, such as is represented by a manufacturer, or what it would reasonably or likely be used for when it's associated with a building. Noting that the NCBP part of our QBCC Act defines building as both building and structure, which can include a deck, pool, unroofed pergola, or a retaining wall or fence. And that's the same definition as is in the Building Act. Other notable parts of the definitions include associated with, which means incorporated into or connected to a building or structure. And that's by carrying out a relevant work for you guys that would be plumbing and drainage work or building work under the Building Act. And a couple of simple examples of that, if you've got something's connected even as simply as by a pipe to the reticulated water system, that could be connected to the building, or you're fixing your kitchen cupboards or a shelf to the wall in the kitchen, and that's fixing it to the building, so it's associated with the building. Okay, three things I want you to remember for today for an intended use: safe, compliance, and representation. Remember those three things. So I'll move on and just talk about safe. So you'll notice in the definition there, it's got the term so far as reasonably practicable. This is a defined term in our Act under Section 74AA, and this is where the QBCC Act differs from the Building Act or the Plumbing and Drainage Act, in that it's not solely reliant on non-compliance with those acts to determine that a product is an NCBP. A product can be compliant with those relevant regulatory provisions, but it can also be considered unsafe and therefore a non-conforming building product. So trying to use an example, reasonably practical, so using stairs, they're provided for circulation, and that is all risks of injury to a person can't be removed. As we all know, walking up and down stairs is not a risk-free proposition. However, stairs that are constructed to the NCC requirements minimise the risk of injury to persons so far as is reasonably practicable, but it doesn't eliminate. So every two-storey house hasn't got a lift. That's because it's not reasonably practical to install one in every home over one story. So quickly on compliance. So products need to comply with the relevant regulatory provisions. As we said, those being the Building Act or the Plumbing and Drainage Act. And these acts, as we know, refer to compliance with the NCC, being the BCA, for you guys, the Plumbing Code of Australia. The QDC applies to both building and plumbing products and other reference standards. So in relation to plumbing products, Part A 5.3 of the NCC gives us some various methods to demonstrate evidence of suitability to support the use of a material or product. These include a Watermark license issued by the Watermark Conformity Assessment Body, or WMCAB as we call them, a product that's listed on the Watermark schedule of products and has a Watermark license, or a product of a type that's listed on the excluded products and has a current certificate from a certification body as meeting the requirements of the Plumbing Code of Australia. Or it could be something simple as having a test report, say for a ASNZS 4020 for a product that's in contact for its intended use, being in contact with drinking water, and that would be issued by an accredited testing laboratory. The other sort of certification you can get would be certification body, which is accredited by JASANS. And lastly, you get a report from a professional engineer or an RPEQ, also a recognised expert for a performance solution when you're complying with the relevant parts of the PCA. Now, as Grant spoke about in his presentation, remember in Queensland, under the PD Act Section 65, the requirement for a product to be a watermark product, otherwise it can't be installed. So it's either got to be mentioned on the schedule of products or in the schedule of excluded products. Moving on to representation. So this is where someone's claiming that a product will do something or will comply with the standard when it doesn't. This can include representing that a product complies with the standard, even if that standard isn't listed in the relevant regulatory provisions. A couple of simple examples. You could have a taps that are sold on an online platform with no watermark, but they're advertised as meeting Australian standards. You could have some kitchen cupboards advertised as meeting 4386, or a lift that someone's putting in, it's a single detached house, and advertising it as meeting the lift code AS 1735. These last two examples are both standards that are not represented in the NCC. However, if a person in the chain of responsibility claims compliance with a standard or part of that standard, then it must comply with all aspects of the standard they're claiming compliance with or the part they're claiming. Noting that compliance with the NCC or a specified standard can depend on whether it's a reference standard, i.e. it's listed in the back in Schedule 4, in which case for us it would form part of the relevant regulatory provisions and be a compliance matter, not a representation matter. So I spoke about chain of responsibility. So who is in the chain of responsibility? That is a person or a company who designs, manufactures, imports, or supplies the building product. It also includes the person who installs the product, and it includes an architect or an engineer who can be in the chain of responsibility if they specify that a product be incorporated into or connected into a building, i.e. it's in their spec or on their plans that they've given for the building. And the person or company can be responsible for more than one part in the chain of responsibility for a building product. So who's the installer? This can include several parties, the obvious one being the person physically undertaking the work, the builder or the plumber doing replacing the kitchen taps or the hot water system. But it also includes the supervisor, the foreperson, the project manager, and the licensed nominee. Potentially, it can also include someone who is, it can also include someone who is engaging a person to do the installing. And this could be contract administrator, project manager, superintendent, or a contractor who engages the subbies or tradespeople to install the product. Could be a principal contractor, could be an owner, possibly even a developer. So how do we check for compliance? One of them is doing laboratory testing. So if you're checking for the authenticity of certificates that are provided for your evidence of suitability, it could be from either a local lab or it could be from overseas. If it's an overseas one, it'll be, you need to look for the International Laboratory Accreditation Corporation, or ILAC for short, with the Mutual Recognition Arrangement signatory. And you can check this on the ILAC website. A couple of examples that you may have seen for different products would be the China National Accreditation Service or the International Accreditation New Zealand system. The common one that we all will be aware of will be the National Association of Testing Authorities, or NATA, and either the ILAC or the NATA are accredited testing laboratories. However, if you're getting a certificate from the testing laboratory, remember to check the scope. You might have, they might be testing something like we see for building products all of the time, where they're doing things for fire rating. However, on the NATA website, there are only 5 places that are accredited to do the AS 1530 Part 4. So you need to make sure you're checking the scope to make sure it's within them if you're using that for being a testing certificate for your evidence. Okay, third-party testing is another one. You can see on the screen there. That's the Watermark license that you'd all be familiar with, issued by the WMCAM bodies, and they're accredited by the Joint Accreditation System of Australia, New Zealand, or JASANS, for the scheme. And there are currently 10 WMCABs for the 2 different classes of Watermark certification, 8 for the most common ones, and you can see on the screen there, there's all their logos that you would probably be familiar with. The other one that we can get is design or certification for a performance solutions. And if it's a performance solution, you need to have your certification from a professional engineer. And in Queensland, if it's professional engineer, they will be registered with the Board of Engineers and be an RPEQ. And obviously, when you're getting any test certificates or reports, please make sure you get the full versions. You may see they can have a test certificate that's used for marketing purposes, but it won't be a certificate that's the full version, or if it's applied to the regulatory impact report that's used for compliance purposes. Okay, so I spoke about earlier on intended use. So the intended use and required information, which are both defined terms, go hand in hand for the limitations and conditions for the use of a product. Required information, which if you want to have a look under section 74 AG, explains for the intended use, as products may have more than one use. An example using the plumbing could be a gate valve that's in the drinking water reticulation system. You could use the same gate valve in the hydrant system, and you could use that same gate valve in an agricultural irrigation system. However, the agricultural irrigation system is not intended for contact with drinking water, so therefore wouldn't need a Watermark certification. The required information will also explain how the product is to be suitable for the use and how it's to be associated or installed, so installation instructions, and it may explain how the product must be used, so any limitations or conditions on using the product, and all these things help to make sure that the product is not an NCBP. So required information, what would be a good example of this? A Watermark certificate of conformity. Right, so on the screen there you can see not a Watermark certificate of conformity, but it's the summary that you'll get from the ABCB website. This is readily available and has all of the same information that's going to be on the certificate, and the key bits of the information shown are a product brand name, the scope of use, which we would call for NCBP the intended use, a product description, and any limitations and conditions that explain how the product is to be associated with the building and how it's to be used, including any installation instructions. This is similar to a code mark certificate of conformity, which is used as evidence of suitability for pure building products for volumes 1 and 2 of the NCC. Okay, I said I'd talk briefly about duties. So for non-conforming building products, there is a primary duty for all persons in the chain of responsibility, and that is to ensure as far as reasonably practicable that a product is not a non-conforming building product. This is a positive duty. That is, everybody in the chain of responsibility must do this. Remembering that reasonably practical is a defined term within our Act, and everybody in the chain of responsibility must give to the next person in the chain all relevant information when they give or supply a product so that it can be used and installed to avoid it being an NCBP. An installer's got to give the building owner all the information when the product's prescribed by regulation. The example that I can think of for this is a fire pump for the maintenance requirements to meet the building fire safety regulation. And also under duties, executive officers of a company, that's their company director, secretary, may include the CEO, must exercise due diligence to ensure that the company complies with its duties. For example, they've got to understand the intended use or uses of a product and take actions, including any risk management procedures to ensure the safe use of all the building products, which is defined in section 74 AI of our Act. Interestingly, they cannot abscond from this responsibility as it applies to the natural person, not just the corporation. So what if you see something on site or plumbers asking a question and they want to know what they can do? They can refer it over to us. Really simple, just search QBCC NCBP, it'll be one of the first couple that pops up on the search engine. Information need to include, you can see the information there on the screen, is the basic information we need. We rely on people in the outside world in the construction industry and like to bring matters to the attention of the QBCC. Very helpful for us if you're talking to plumbers or you're bringing information yourselves, if you can briefly explain why you believe it's a potential non-conforming building product, which standards it's allegedly not complying with, and if there's any photos or documentation, if you've been given a test certificate that you think's a bit suspicious, that's demonstrating why you believe it's a non-conforming building product. or any other documents you have. If you've seen it on a website, if you can please do a screen snip and remember to go all the way down to the bottom corner of the screen, get the date and time for us, as that's very helpful when representation matters are being considered, as people quite often, once we start talking to them, start changing what they had, but there may have already been products used in the manner they represented it could be done. Let anyone know that you're talking to, they can report suspected NCBPs anonymously if they decide. However, if say that was a plumber that was giving it to us, and it may be that makes it difficult for us to discern if they're a person in the chain of responsibility and that they have discharged their duties or obligations to notify the Commission of suspected NCBP. And important to remember too that there are sections in our Act that prevent the release of information in inappropriate circumstances. So that's all I have for today for you. If you've got any questions, pop them in the chat. Otherwise, email them to us. And if you think of something you want to ask us later on, email it there, ncbp@qbcc.qld.gov.au. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Zane. Absolute well of knowledge. So next up, we'll have Grant. Grant, if you're able to turn on your microphone and video camera, then we'll be able to get into the next section there. Thank you.
Yep, that's great. Thanks, Harm. So I'm just going to the second part of moving on. We're going to talk about. I'm just going to talk about. I'll briefly talk about defective notifiable work, and then I'm going to just move on then to we'll go straight into our fire audits and just give you some general information about our auditing process and some of the results that we see from that. But as I'm sure you're all well aware of, the plumbing and drainage legislation in Queensland establishes jurisdictional authority for local governments in the assessment and inspection of plumbing and drainage work. What this means is that local governments or local government plumbing inspectors have an essential role in ensuring compliance with the relevant regulation and codes for the trade. And this extends both to permit work and notifiable work. As again, I'm sure you're all well aware of, the introduction of notifiable work happened back in November 2012, and that's close to 10 years ago, and yeah, how quickly time flies. So this meant that plumbers and drainers had a greater scope of work in which they could do the work without first needing a permit, and then obviously having to request local governments to inspect that work. The potential consequence of this, however, was in the failure of plumbers and drainers to adhere to code requirements, particularly when they were to consider the risks that their work wouldn't be audited by the local government. So that's because obviously there's no statutory mandate to carry out these audits. So auditing notifiable work ensures public health and safety, or that the public health and safety is protected, and that the public confidence in the regulatory system is maintained. The QBCC is able to monitor compliance, particularly when we're provided information from local governments about the audits that were undertaken. And we're assisted by this through the arrangements that we have with the work performance agreements. So to give you an idea of the compliance for notifiable work audits, we have put together some figures which we thought you'd be interested in knowing. Since January 2020, there was a total of 7,724 audits that have been carried out by local governments. Approximately 16% of those failed, with only a small percentage failing because of an administration error. For example, the licensee hadn't selected the correct category of notifiable work. Majority found issues with the work itself. So interestingly, we had 7 licensees that have been identified as failing in excess of 10 audits. There was one in particular where it was as high as 24 audits. So not only is the register a useful tool in collecting data for non-compliance, we do ourselves hold data in relation to complaints that we receive about defective work. So over the past 2 years, 70% of those defective work complaints that we receive actually involve notifiable work. So of that, there's about 80% that were found to be complaints about hot water heater installations. So QBCC's investigations into these matters have generally found that the work associated with generally found that work was associated with the installation of hot water heaters, and it was found that that work was defective. Majority of those, however, were actually found to be minor in nature. For example, failing to comply with the insulation requirements. You can see from the figures provided that there are still concerns regarding the standards of work carried out by plumbers and drainers. So the QBCC, like I mentioned earlier, it continues to provide information to licensees, and this is to assist in promoting the standards or the acceptable standards of work that's carried out in that trade. Again, when I mentioned before that we're currently working on producing educational videos for licensees, and we're specifically starting with short videos on hot water heaters, and this is to assist licensees increase their knowledge about that, the installation requirements. And we find that this is probably one of this is currently one of the top defects that we're sort of seeing. And so, as I mentioned earlier before, the implementation of a interagency referral would have great benefits, again, to both local government and to plumbing and drainage trade by holding the licensees accountable for their work. So, like I said before, if you have licensees out there that continually carry out defective work, we want to know about them, who they are, and provide as much information as you can, so that we can sort of correct that behaviour and promote those standards and increase their competency with carrying out that work. So when our educational videos are completed, they will be available on our YouTube channel, but they'll also be available on our website as well. So watch out or watch this space. I'll quickly move into fire auditing. So auditing involves our auditing itself includes auditing the licensing component of fire protection systems, and it is actually an essential piece of work that it's an important piece of work that we do, and it's paramount to our compliance activities. We work that into our operational plan throughout the year. So our audits do target established reticulated water-based fire protection systems, and our audits are there to detect any unlicensed fire protection work. Our focus is particularly on those who undertake the maintenance of these systems, but it also involves those who test and inspect the systems as well. So by doing this, it ensures that only persons with an appropriate license undertake this work, and this is important in terms of safeguarding the community. So the current fire protection licensing framework is actually one of the most comprehensive in Australia. It involves a range of classes that relate to fire protection work, which specifically is designed to accommodate for the niche industry that it is. A recent review of the fire protection license, it sort of simplified the license classes, and it was available to better reflect changing industry practice, and to also recognise the more broadly available technical qualifications for this work. And it was also to facilitate improvement to standards across that particular industry. There's a new streamlined fire protection licensing framework, and that became effective from 1 May 2021. So as you can see from on the screen there, it sets out the new framework, and we have 5 license streams, that being passive, special hazard fire systems, water-based fire systems, and we've got portable and electrical. Beyond that, we've got 4 license classes, including design, certify, install, maintain, and inspect and test. And further, we have 3 license classes, being contractors, nominee supervisors, and fire protection occupational license. So some licensees who have automatically transitioned to the new framework will be required over the coming years to upskill and complete additional qualifications and/or units of competency. There are specific timeframes by which this upskilling must be completed and notified to the QBCC. And in these circumstances, licensees will receive notification from us confirming these requirements and these timeframes. As part of the legislation change, key definitions have been updated to provide clarification on the scope of work across these classes. This has a direct impact on the type of work that be completed under each class. As I mentioned before, design, certify, maintain, maintain, and test, inspect. And so the biggest change comes to the certify class, whereby under the new framework, the certify class are no longer able to complete inspect and test. And so an additional class is actually required for any test and inspect work, other than when the person's purely doing a visual survey that is required to support the issuing of a certificate or a statement, or to complete an inspection and or testing in accordance with the relevant standard of or other equipment. So the importance of the new framework for our audits is that for water-based fire protection systems, the inspect and test license class is not available. Therefore, the install and maintain license will be required. So the fire pump inspect and test class is a continuing class of license, and that may be held by transitioning licensees with no change to the current scope of work. So in terms of, so that was just a sort of a brief overview of the licensing framework. When it comes to our audits, when we conduct our audits, investigators will go out and request access to maintenance records such as logbooks. These records will identify the person who carried out the inspection and testing of the relevant fire protection system. But there are also other records that are relevant to our investigators, and that includes Form 72. And this is the fire hydrant and sprinkler system periodic testing and maintenance record. We also have an occupier statement that we sort of look at, and this allows investigators to confirm the types of fire protection systems that are installed on the premises. And we also look for the certificate of classification, and this allows our investigators to confirm when the fire protection system was certified, and this is relevant for the purpose of knowing when or whether a survey ought to have been completed. So with our audits, they are generally completed by investigators attending the premises in person, or alternatively, our investigators request occupiers of the premises to provide us a copy with those relevant records. We use the term desktop audit to describe that particular scenario. So this desktop audit allows us to extend our reach to regional areas. However, we do have investigators that are also able to target these regional areas in person as well, and typically that's when we're sort of visiting those areas for other reasons. So with the audits that we've conducted for this financial year to date, we've actually found that there's a very high compliance rate in relation to those who we've identified as carrying out that fire protection work. So as we continue further beyond under the new licensing framework, we're hoping to see equally pleasing results. Yeah, well, obviously we'll sort of know in future how that goes. So as again mentioned before, if you've got any questions, if you want more information, please email us, and our details are there up on the screen, or if you want to get in contact with us for whatever reason, please do so either through calling us or again emailing us. For further information on fire licensing as well, you can go to our website. We have a whole range of information available for you there as well. And that's it from me. Thanks, Harm.
Great, thank you so much, Grant. And I think now we're into the Q&A segment of the presentation. So that brings us to the end. Grant and Zane, shall we get into the Q&A?
Let's go.
Perfect, okay. I'll just wait for Grant.
Sorry, I was just grabbing a drink of water.
No problem, thank you, sir. Okay, well, let's get into it. And in fact, the first question is probably for you, Grant, so we'll start with you. So we've got the question, let's see. You mentioned that you intend on publishing videos, and you mentioned hot water, heater installations and overflow relief gullies. What other topics do you plan to publish videos on?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So based on what we see and what we hear from people such as local government plumbing inspectors, we believe that more education is required around the requirements for notifiable work. For example, when notifiable work is finished. There are also what we hear about is sort of a lack of knowledge around home warranty insurance and contracts, and some of the other the obligations that people have under the legislation. We sort of believe that yeah, plumbing and drainage contractors lack some knowledge in that space. So we're probably more likely to focus our attention towards these areas as well.
Perfect, thank you, Grant. Let's see, I think this second question might be for you as well, Grant. Question is, how does the QBCC deal with serial offenders of defective or non-compliant or non-compliant plumbing and drainage work?
Yeah, another really good question. So I guess the action that the QBCC takes sort of really depends on the circumstances of each case. Generally speaking, repeat offenders may incur a more substantial enforcement response compared to, I guess, someone who is a first-time offender of the same type of breach. A substantial enforcement approach sort of might include issuing an infringement notice, and typically this is where a warning has been issued previously. We've got disciplinary action, or we've got prosecution. So in terms of the decision to commence prosecution, there are considerations that we need to take into account. And this includes whether there's sufficient, I guess, sufficient evidence to substantiate the offence, and therefore that there's a reasonable prospect of conviction in that case. And also there's got to be a public interest that requires that prosecution. There is likely merit in prosecuting a person who has performed plumbing and drainage work that is defective, to the extent that it has caused, or not even caused, but is likely to have caused a danger to a person's health and safety, or it can actually cause significant loss as well. So repeatedly performing plumbing or defective plumbing drainage work that is low risk to the public or to the environment, it might not meet the threshold for prosecution, but it may be sufficient to establish grounds for disciplinary action. So as I mentioned in my presentation, disciplinary actions should be directed primarily for the protection of the public, and therefore it might be appropriate under circumstances to suspend or condition a person's license. And I mentioned in my case study, or in that case study, that we had actually taken that approach to a repeat offender, I guess. So when we suspend a person's license, it actually operates even and conditioning a person's license in a way it sort of prevent. It's there to prevent, or sorry, operates as a way to prevent any immediate risks of further non-compliance, and it's also likely there to deter any future offending when their license is reinstated in the case of a suspension. So I guess a lot of information, but just to clarify, decisions are generally based on a case-by-case basis, but generally more a more substantial enforcement approach would be taken, such as disciplinary action, and it's likely to be taken against a repeat offender that's generally for the same breach. So I hope that sort of answers the question.
Thank you, very comprehensive. Thanks, Grant. I think the next question, Zane, might be for you. So the question we've got here is, given that compliant products may be shown on the approved plans, then due to the product supply chain shortages, product substitution is common. What do you suggest regarding proof of the product?
Thanks, Harm. We get asked this type of question quite often. So firstly, if anyone's considering substitution of materials, they need to think about that carefully. They've got to obviously get the suitable evidence, the appropriate evidence of suitability, and I gave examples of that during the presentation for the product. And they need to, and that would then contribute to checking that the proposed product meets the compliance part of the relevant provisions for us for the NCBP stuff. And then obviously they're then considering, that's the compliance part of the safe compliance and representation, so that they're making sure they're fulfilling their primary duty to make sure the product's not a non-conforming building product. But also any substitution needs to be checked with the project's hydraulic engineer, the RPQ or the QBCC licensed designer, or if it was swapping something like they're getting taxed from somewhere else, say they're bringing them in from overseas or something, they need to check with the architect or the building designer that those swaps can be appropriate. And then amended documentation should be given to the local government so that you guys keep all the records, not just for the product being swapped now, but that helps everyone out, 5-10 years down the track when alterations are being done, because that's the product that's being substituted is kept a record of and gone into the record system. But remember people have to check the evidence of suitability, because we are having supply chain issues at the moment and things need to be swapped, but needs to be looked at and then recorded appropriately.
Fantastic, thank you, Zane. And I think this next question might be for you as well. So we've got, the next question is, what happens if the Watermark documents are out of date or the manufacturer is no longer trading?
Okay, two-part answer. So first part, watermarks. If the Watermark certificate of conformity is out of date, i.e. not current, then it wouldn't satisfy the evidence of suitability requirement for part A53, which would require a current Watermark certificate of conformity to satisfy the rules of the Watermark certification scheme and the manual for the Watermark certification scheme. Second part, however, if the product concerned was manufactured with an appropriate Watermark license prior to the certificate of currency lapsing, or prior to, say, a manufacturer disappearing or no longer trading, that license, as long as the product's made in accordance with the license, the approval or license binds on the product not to the manufacturer. So if product was made and it's made in January, but the company goes broke in August and it's still being sold in December, well, when it was made in January, it was made and it complies. So the certification binds to the product. So that's how that would be applied.
Great, thank you. Grant, this might be for you. I think we've got a couple more questions here, but this one would be for you, I think, Grant. Okay, so the question we've got is, what does the QBCC, or what, I'm going to read it verbatim. It says, what does the QBCC investigators do when they find that the occupier doesn't have all of the relevant fire protection records?
Yeah, another good question. So there are times when the investigators will find that the records aren't available when they do carry out their audits, and this is generally because either the occupier doesn't know where the records are kept, particularly when they're dealing with assistant store managers for a commercial premises, or sometimes the records are kept in digital form off-site. So on occasions, we have found that logbooks were not available because the fire system hadn't actually been tested for some time. Where the records aren't available, our investigators will generally work with the occupier of the premises to obtain these copies. Or alternatively, we do refer the matter, or we refer the matter to the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, and this is generally in relation to potential non-compliance with the building and fire safety regulation. In any case, where we do suspect that there's non-compliance with the fire safety regulation, we will automatically refer that to QFES, as they're the sort of relevant authority that has jurisdiction to enforce and monitor compliance with the regulations. So I guess just to confirm, yeah, there are times where we might have the records, and we'll make every effort to track down those records. And if we can't, then we refer the matter to QFES to manage compliance and enforce compliance.
Great, thank you, Grant. I think we've got a couple more questions. This one I think might be for you, Zane. The question is, can I buy, sell, or import non-accredited products?
Okay, if you're just looking at the Plumbing and Drainage Act, that information would say, yes, you can, because it's, remember Grant was talking about section 65, which is the requirements for installing only things that are watermarked products. And that actually is advertised, or was last time I looked recently, on the ABCB website for their frequently asked questions for the Look for the Watermark campaign. However, the non-conforming building products requirements of our QBCC Act also need to be considered. And remember, a building product is any material or other thing associated with, or that could be associated with the building. So thinking back to the chain of responsibility, the manufacturer, importer, seller, or supplier of the product, and the primary duty, make sure a product is not a non-conforming building product for the intended use. Well, so when does that apply? Well, that applies at the time of manufacture or importation or offer for sale, or if you're not selling it, someone's just ripped over the border to get something that they've brought in from overseas. When they give it to the plumber to install, then that's when that would apply. So people have to consider the non-conforming building products part of the legislation as well. And that was obviously just to make sure that, you know, it's not just the poor old plumber that is the person trying to be held responsible.
That's fantastic. Thanks, folks. Look, I think we've come to the end of it at the moment. I think that's the last question I can see here. Let's round out today's presentation. We've gone a little bit over time, but I think that's fine. There's been great information that we've provided. So Grant and Zane, thank you very, very much for your participation in the webinar. We'd also like to thank our attendees for coming along as well. Remember, there is a brief survey. There's always surveys for the event seeking your feedback, which we'd very much appreciate. And thank you, folks, and bye for now. Thanks once again, Zane and Grant. Cheers.
Thank you.